And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. This is our live coverage of the annual Chicago Tribune's Printers Row Lit Fest. You're looking at one of the venues. This is Jones College Prep High School. They've hosted us all weekend. We're live today, and author Thomas Ricks is next. His book is Churchill and Orwell, The Fight for Freedom.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 33rd Annual Chicago Tribune Printers Row Lit Fest. I want to give a special thank you to our sponsors. Today's program will be broadcast live on C-SPAN 2 Book TV. If there's time at the end of the Q&A session with the author, we ask that you use the microphone provided so that the viewers at home can hear you. Before we begin today's program, please silence your phones and turn off all flashes on the cameras. And now, please welcome our interviewer, Associate Editor at the Chicago Tribune, Colin McMahon.
Good afternoon. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Thanks for coming to Printers Row Lit Fest. And I'm thrilled to be here today with Tom Ricks, who's written several books, and we're going to talk about his latest. But some of you may know Tom's previous books, The Generals, which I think was the most recent one, and of course, Fiasco, which was a New York Times #1 bestseller. This one is also on the bestseller list, charting there, I think, last week for the first time, so congratulations on that. First question is about a previous book, actually, Fiasco. Given the state of affairs today, international, national affairs, do you wish that maybe you had held back on titling a book Fiasco?
It's a little bit close to home, that question. But you're right, I never thought we'd be living in the situation we're living in this country now.
So let's talk a little bit about this book, Churchill and Orwell, The Fight for Freedom. I'm going to set it up. I'm going to read one small passage, which kind of tells you the theme that runs throughout this book, and then ask Tom to talk a little bit about why he chose these two guys. So the theme, in my view, is this. Orwell and Churchill have many differences, and Tom will talk about that, but when you look for similarities, I think it comes down to this. Orwell and Churchill recognized that the key question of their century ultimately was not who controlled the means of production, as Marx thought, or how the human psyche functioned, as Freud taught, but rather how to preserve the liberty of the individual during an age when the state was becoming powerfully intrusive into private life. So, do I got it right? Is that the theme? And how did you come upon these two guys and to tell that story?
It is the theme. You really picked it. I'm impressed. It took me a while to kind of settle on the theme. The book began after I wrote The Generals. I was thinking of myself more as a writer and less as a reporter. I was really leaving daily journalism and becoming a full-time book writer. And kind of as my farewell to journalism, I went back and read a lot of the famous 20th century journalists, wondering who would last and who would be discarded. I began with H.L. Mencken, found his style anachronistic and his politics wrong. I moved on to S.J. Perlman, not funny. I read E.B. White, wonderful prose stylist, but his concerns weren't mine at all. Hemingway, blowhard. And then I picked up Orwell, and it was so different from all these other stale writers. George Orwell died in 1950, but his prose style feels like it was written today. You know, as a newspaper person, you could drop a paragraph out of Orwell into today's newspaper, and it would be right at home. And his concerns are the concerns of today. What do you do to protect the individual's freedom in an era of the intrusive state, and now in an era of the intrusive corporation? How do you think about liberty? What's the vocabulary we need to discuss governments that don't listen to people? And a lot of the vocabulary that we use, Big Brother, the memory hole, comes directly from Orwell's 1984. So as I was diving more and more into Orwell and going back and rereading a lot of them, it occurred to me, wow, there was a parallel here with Churchill. As you say, very different people, one on the right, one on the left. Churchill, an imperialist conservative, Orwell, a dedicated anti-imperialist socialist. just totally different personalities. Yet they came down to that, what is the key question of our time? And they were in the minority. It's important to remember that most people thought they were wrong. They both spent a lot of time in the wilderness because they were willing to criticize their own political sides. And that I found inspiring as well. It turns out they never met, so you ask yourself, well, why would you write such a book? But they admire each other from afar. Does anybody here remember the name of the hero of 1984? It's Winston, right. As long as we're paying Stump the Chump. Anybody remember the middle name of John Lennon? Winston. People were being named Winston back then. And John Lennon was born, of course, during the Battle of Britain, October 9th, 1940.
Huh. That I did not. That's not in the book. But there is actually a sly dig at Hemingway in the book. So Orwell also covered and fought in the Spanish Civil War, and as did Hemingway, of course. And there's a point at which you kind of slip in a little dig at Hemingway, quoting somebody who called Hemingway boozy, preoccupied with the image rather than the reality. So there's some other spots in here, Tom, where you're slipping in some modern day digs.
I am. Hemingway, as you might guess, is a special peeve of mine. He reminds me a little bit of 60 Minutes. That is, he wasn't really a war correspondent, but he played one. 60 Minutes famously says, we're not really reporters, but we play one on TV. There's a kind of also a running theme there. Yeah, a lot of the stuff my very good editor made me put in the footnotes. If you read the book, check out the footnotes after you read it, because there's a lot of good stuff in there that he said, no, get it out of the book.
Yeah, editors. So talking about these two guys, they were on the outskirts. They were outcasts from their own groups, and they were ridiculed for being out of touch. But there's a phrase in here that captures what they did that very few people were able to do, and they were able to ascertain the long-range meaning of sudden changes, right? The long-range meaning of sudden changes, and that is that Orwell knew before anybody else what Stalin was up to. Churchill knew before anybody else, or was able to articulate it before anybody else, what Hitler was up to. So that long-range meaning of sudden changes, talk a little bit about that.
It's intriguing to me, and that actually goes to why Orwell is much more famous now than he was in his own time, and why Churchill spent the 1930s isolated from his own Conservative Party, mocked by them and thought by a lot of politicians to be washed up and finished. I think they both began from first principles. They both believe that freedom begins with the individual at the atomic level, and it's essentially the right of the individual to think, to observe, to come to the individual conclusions about what they see, to trust their own perceptions, and to express themselves as they see fit and associate with other people who might want to discuss the same issues. So in 1984, this boils down to Winston saying, it all comes down to 2 + 2 = 4. If you're able to say that and believe it, everything else will flow from that. Of course, by the end of that book, the government Big Brother has tortured him into stating and believing that 2 + 2 = 5.
So state intrusion into the realm of the private individual, right? State intrusion into the realm of the private individual is the one constant here. When we look at today's world, you could look at a bunch of different things, right? So I think some of the things that you address in the book are torture by the government, drone strikes by the US government, the NSA, of course, and the electronic eavesdropping that is so prevalent, propaganda, alternative facts. There's a lot of different ways in there that a lot of different elements that you address. When you think about Orwell, what do you think his message is for today? Which of those areas is he most on point about, in your view?
Well, I think he's really on point. This is the surprise of 1984, is how much he is able, writing in 1948, to sense the nature of today's world, or the dangers of today's world. We don't live in a totalitarian world, but we live in a world in which these threats are ever present. So the use of torture by the US government as policy never happened until after 9/11. He describes an age of permanent warfare in which Winston cannot remember a time in which his country was not at war. That's the same true of basically anybody in this country who's 18 years old or younger. They cannot remember a time when America was not conducting airstrikes and special operations raids in corners of the world, which is the way he describes it in 1984. Obscure wars being fought that nobody really paid much attention to, except when a bomb went off in a city. Why did he anticipate this so well? He observed, he thought about his own observations, he was shocked by what he saw in the Spanish Civil War, talking about fake news, not only that the left, not only that the right lied. As a socialist, he expected that the right-wing newspapers would get it wrong. He was shocked also to find the left-wing newspapers got it wrong. And he has an eloquent paragraph that really is about fake news, where he says, entire battles have been fought that were said now never to have occurred. Men were described as heroes who had never heard a shot fired in a battle. And he's very puzzled by this, and that's really what triggers him into saying, I'm not going to go with anybody's party line. I'm going to begin by trusting my own instincts. And that's why at the end of the book, I go to Martin Luther King writing from the Birmingham City Jail, very much inheriting Orwell's tradition and saying, here are the facts of the matter. Birmingham is the most segregated city in America. Here is the fact of the matter. The US government tells us that the Negro has rights, but the local security forces do not permit us to exercise those rights. And he lays out the facts. So again, I think what you have, Churchill, Orwell, and Martin Luther King, have your principles, discover the facts, trust your own judgments, and apply your principles to those facts to decide on your course of action. And I think it's something we all could benefit from in these troubled, turbulent times.
Yeah, that line, that paragraph that you mentioned ends this way. I saw, in fact, history being written not in terms of what happened, but of what ought to have happened, according to various, quote, party lines. And I wonder what, what Orwell would think of today's, White House Communications Office, for starters, right?
I think he'd be appalled by news as entertainment, which is a hit not just on Fox News, but also on MSNBC and similar shows. I want to say C-SPAN is not news as entertainment. C-SPAN is pure information.
Nice. Well done.
I think both Orwell and Churchill would be shocked by the degree to which opinion is given more weight nowadays than facts. But they saw this in the 1930s, that as loud as something was shouted over and over and loudly enough, people would believe it. I mean, his other famous novel is Animal Farm, which, by the way, if you haven't read it, is worth going back to it. You can read it in an evening. It's pretty short, and it's very funny. And I mention this because talking about endless repetition until people believe it, the sheep in Animal Farm are kind of the morons of the farm. But they love chanting, and they walk around chanting all day, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, until finally the birds get upset and tell them to knock it off.
So one of the things, you had mentioned earlier that Orwell's estimation has risen so dramatically. I mean, this is a guy who sold hundreds or thousands of titles in his lifetime and has now surpassed 50 million, I think it is, right? And even in the book, you get the sense that in many ways Churchill dwarfs Orwell, right? But at the end, what's lasting, of course, is the writing. So the writing from Orwell, talk a little bit about the writing from Churchill, because that's how I think you got into it, right?
I began with Orwell, and Orwell, of his own writing, said, my ambition is to write as transparently as a window pane. And I think he achieves that. And I think in many ways, Orwell invents the modern op-ed, the newspaper column, where you have a clear statement of an observation, laying out a few facts, exploring their implications. Winston Churchill is such a different guy. If Winston Churchill's writing was a window, it would be the stained glass in a cathedral with rays of green and red and blue shining down. In his wonderful little essay on painting, which is also worth reading to understand his thinking on strategy, Churchill says, "I honestly feel sorry for the drab colors, the browns and the grays." Churchill lived life as a pageant. A cabinet member once complained that arguing with Winston in cabinet meetings is like trying to argue with the brass band. And I kind of felt that as I was writing this book. This was a difficult book to write. I've written 6 books. This was the 6th. And, it was a hard one. My editor read the first draft and said, "This stinks, redo it." But, you know, an editor's a little bit like a spouse. You have to have a trusting relationship. And I'd be writing about Orwell and trying to listen to him. Orwell he never writes about his personal life. He's an introvert. He writes about his chickens more in his diaries than he writes about his wife. And I'd be sitting there trying to listen to George's little whispery voice. And Churchill would just come marching through like the Energizer Bunny. "No, listen to me, listen to me." You know, he's like a big kid sometimes.
Yeah, and yet you like his writing, right? I think when you dissect some of Churchill's writings, you have a lot of praise for it. While at the same time, it is awfully showy in parts, right? My favorite part is when he counseled the president at the time of the United States. You might be familiar with his work, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He counseled him to use fewer adjectives and adverbs, which made me, think, physician, heal thyself, right?
Well, and remember, FDR's response is to counsel Churchill on what to do about India. To which Churchill muttered, "At least we didn't kill all our Indians." It was a tough relationship between those two. It's important, but it was not just lovey-dovey, which is the way sometimes it's presented nowadays.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Take us through a little bit. Churchill was, they even called him half-breed American at some point. His mother was American, right? Orwell didn't know the United States very well, but the presence of the United States, the growing power of the United States was significant, and both of them, in some ways, missed it.
Well, I think Orwell did. I don't think Churchill really missed it that much. Churchill, being half American, another crack of his is when he was invited to speak in front of the Congress, December 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. He got up and basically the first thing he said was, "Well, thank you for inviting me here, but I like to think had my father been American, I would have gotten here by myself." Churchill was fascinated by America, spent a lot of time in America, in fact, was nearly killed crossing Fifth Avenue early in the 1930s because being British, he looked the wrong way. A car hit him and dragged him about 30 feet. His scalp was open, several ribs were broken. It was interesting that both these guys nearly died in the 1930s. Churchill was shot right through the neck in the Spanish Civil War, and it was very lucky not to have his, I'm sorry, yeah, or I always say the wrong one. Orwell was shot through the neck and was very lucky not to have his spinal cord or the artery or his windpipe destroyed, which would, of course, have killed him. America, as Christopher Hitchens said, is Orwell's great blind spot. He never came to America. He was intrigued by 19th century America, but never really got it on his agenda. And I think that does affect his understandings of economics, especially. The economic system he witnessed was late industrial capitalism under the British aristocracy. Not innovative, doesn't invest sufficiently in industry, disdains the application of university research to the factory. So again and again, they're doing very good research in British universities, and they invent penicillin, they invent most of radar. But again and again, the Americans quickly surpass them. And so, for example, the British in the 1950s drop out of the mass automobile industry. They only do a few luxury vehicles. They drop out of the aeronautics industry, and they never get into the information industry. There is no British IBM or Apple. Had Orwell come to America, I think he would have seen a very different sort of economics. The British system he saw was simply concerned with twisting out a little bit more efficiency, cutting wages or cutting investment. He never saw the dynamism of the information age economy that we've seen develop over the last 30 years in this country, which after all is based on failure. If you're going to innovate, you're going to fail most of the time. It's not looking for efficiency because innovation is very inefficient. The interesting thing is the writer Dave Eggers took 1984 and placed it in Silicon Valley and addressed a lot of those defects and wrote the very good novel The Circle, which is turned into what I'm told is not a very good movie, The Circle.
Yeah. So the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt, critical to the success of the Allies in World War II, of course. But talk a little bit about the British in general and their view of the United States. You know, when I was reading the book, I was reminded, I went to a 40th birthday party for a British friend of mine, and I was the American guest, right? And everybody kept coming up to me and saying, well, so what do Americans think of us? You know, and you know, the first couple times you're nice and polite, and the third drink in, you're like, well, we don't, right? And I think that's kind of the what you start to see in the 40s. Talk a little bit about that relationship between the two countries.
In an alternative life, I'd like to have time to write all these books that I would love to get into, but you have to choose. You can only write so many books. One book I'd love to write is how the power of Britain becomes the power of America in the summer of 1944, and how the British suddenly realized, my God, they are just going to shove us aside. Another book I'd like to write is characteristic figures of British society, because the characteristic figure of British society in the 1930s is Chamberlain, the appeaser, the prime minister who thinks you can feed Hitler little bits of Europe and that'll take care of him. The figure of the 40s, of course, is Churchill. The figure of the 1950s in Britain, I would argue, is Philby. Mm-hmm. Kim Philby, the spy, British aristocrat, Russian spy, which they paper over with James Bond. There's a reason that James Bond becomes, I think, so popular. Oh no, here's a good spy, you know. He actually is not a traitor. And then I think the characteristic figure of the 1960s is the Beatles for England. Well, what that shows you is in the 1950s, both the British left and the British right agreed on one thing. They disdained America. The aristocratic people did. At the same time that was happening, and this is what fascinates me and would make a whole other book, British working class kids in Liverpool and elsewhere embraced American culture as it never had been embraced in Britain before. I mean, suddenly you've got these kids who grow up in parts of England trying their best to sound like African American field hands and succeeding and making a lot of money on it. And so in many ways, this class system divides over the question of America. And I think that still persists. The working class fascination with America. If you've ever been in Manchester and you see the direct flights to Orlando, I mean, basically the whole British working class is going to Disney World.
So let's stay on class. One thing that surprised me was, I'm not saying Churchill was a progressive by any stretch, but one thing that surprised me was Churchill's understanding of the dynamics and even sympathy toward the middle class and working class. Talk a little bit about that in the RAF and other areas.
One way you can really get a good perspective on your own peers and your own class is they all start denouncing you. And remember, Churchill spent the 1930s being abused by members of his own class who generally were pretty sympathetic to fascism and even to Nazism. A relative of his, Lord Londonderry, was head of the House of Lords and a cabinet minister for a while in the 1930s. He kept in his office his whole life a gift that he'd had from the Nazi party of a SS trooper as a porcelain statue. The British Foreign Office ordered the British national football or soccer team when they played in Berlin to give the Nazi salute. We forget how much Britain was kind of cozying up, especially the ruling party. And the American ambassador to London, Joseph Kennedy, thought that was exactly the right thing to do. And in fact, he writes a letter to Franklin Roosevelt, September 11th, 1939, advising Roosevelt to make peace with Germany because the British were going to lose. That very same day, by the way, FDR opens up his famous back channel to Churchill, I think in response to his distrust of Joe Kennedy. So where was I getting with all this?
Class.
So they're both attuned to class issues. And Orwell, of course, sees the world through a bit of a class prism, so that's natural. But Churchill, in the Battle of Britain, notices something interesting. The pilots of the Royal Air Force are not the aristocracy. He actually asked for numbers. How many pilots went to Eton or Harrow, the two most elite and prestigious private schools? And he finds it's just a very small number. Of the 5,000 pilots who win the Battle of Britain and help stave off the German invasion that everybody expected in 1940, they were middle class and lower middle class. They were the sons of government clerks, of rural clergy, of grocery store managers. And Churchill observes rather stridently, they have saved the country, they have earned the right to run it. And in that sense, Margaret Thatcher is Churchill's natural heir. She is the daughter of a grocer from the countryside. She experiences a lot of class sort of snobbery, her own life as she grows up. And one of the things she does upon becoming prime minister is restore the war rooms where Churchill fought World War II. And she goes to Czechoslovakia and gives a speech apologizing for how the British gave Czechoslovakia to Hitler in 1938.
So that
39, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and so that part was a surprise to me. Was there anything in writing this book that you discovered about Churchill or Orwell that surprised you dramatically?
A lot surprised me. It's one reason I enjoyed it. You write a book because you're trying to ask questions or answer a question, figure things out. The first thing that surprised me is that these two men are so human. They are both failures for most of their lives. They fail in most of the things they do for most of their lives. Orwell, as we were saying earlier, is really an unknown author and not very successful until the last couple of years of his life, and then he dies at age 46. Churchill is a failure for much of his life. He has an awful father, unhappy youth. He's desperate to get some glory, and then he's blamed for a big fiasco in World War I. He sort of goes into political exile, and then in the 1930s, he's really at odds with his own party. Churchill really only has one great year. But if you're going to have one great year, make it Churchill in 1940, because he saved the West. Had somebody else been prime minister, and the king wanted somebody else, and a lot of people thought someone else, like Lord Halifax, should be prime minister, England almost certainly would have made peace with Germany in 1940. And it was Churchill who rallied the British people, who insisted they would not have a peace agreement, and who gave a series of speeches in 1940 that pulled the country together and mobilized it. And the speeches are great political speeches. They're very tough, and they're very truthful. I mean, the speeches we remember, we will fight them on the beaches. This is their finest hour, blood, sweat, and tears. Those are all 1940. And we will fight them on the beaches is remarkable because it describes a fighting retreat. If the Germans invade, he says, we will fight them on the beaches. We will fight them on the landing fields. We'll fight them in the cities. We will fight them in the hills. He's describing fighting and retreating from the Germans as they come over the country. This was startling stuff to hear in England at that time. I think that Churchill's speeches that year are the literary equivalent of Orwell's greatest essays.
And yet, after 43, his speeches were far more infrequent, far less passionate. Did he run out of gas? Was it just too much? What do you think?
Everybody pretty much ran out of gas. Remember, FDR doesn't survive the war. Churchill is pretty much a burnout case by 1945, and I think the British public realizes this when they vote him out of office in July 1945, even before World War II has ended in the Pacific. I think World War II just consumed these guys, especially Churchill. And it led me to think, though, it was their very flaws, and these are flawed people, who made them able to do what they did. If Churchill had been more empathetic, he had almost no empathy. If he'd been more sympathetic to people, I think it would have crushed him. Instead, he goes through World War II very concerned about how much booze do I get today? Where is my pink silk underwear? He loves wearing his pink silk underwear. He goes to breakfast at the British Embassy in Cairo during the war and asks the ambassador's wife over the breakfast table for a carafe of white wine. And she raises her eyebrows. And he says, "Don't worry, madam, I've already had 2 whiskey sodas." Orwell's a very different story. He comes home one night during World War II, and his wife very nicely has left a plate of dinner for him on the table. But he's very absent-minded and kind of self-denying. And by mistake, he feeds his dinner to the cat, and he eats the cat's dinner and doesn't finally notice until he's finished.
So we're going to take a few questions. I'm going to ask Tom one more question at least. But if you want to line up to ask questions, that's fine. I've got a bunch here. I'm going to actually, while we're doing that, lay a big one on you, and that is, so he runs out of gas. You have a plea toward the end of the book about people, rigorously finding out the facts, rigorously challenging their assumptions, allowing their colleagues and their bosses and everybody else to challenge their assumptions and really work through that, and then make decisions based on principles. And I'm thinking, I'm just reading this book and I can feel Churchill's fatigue. And I'm reading this challenge and thinking, man, that's a lot of work. So how do we do this in the modern day? How do we hold ourselves to that standard?
It is a lot of work. The first thing I suggest is turn off your TV, except for C-SPAN. I live in rural Maine on an island, and I remain very well informed without watching the television, except for baseball. And what I've noticed lately, especially since our last presidential election, is I've been trying very consciously to see who out there fits this pattern of principles and facts. And one group that I've really started paying a lot of attention to is anti-Trump conservatives. They're valuable to me because I'm not a conservative. I don't have their perspective. I don't have sort of their, I don't carry some of those values in my heart. But I respect them. So, for example, these people are very tied to tradition and to supporting American institutions. And so I'm thinking here, for example, of at the Atlantic Monthly, David Frum and Elliot Cohen; at the Washington Post, Michael Gerson and Jennifer Rubin; Max Boot is another one. These are people who say, and are writing very loudly, some of the most interesting and important things about our new president. They're saying, for example, he is not a conservative. He is a radical reactionary. He has no loyalty to traditional institutions. In fact, he's ignorant of our most important document, the U.S. Constitution, seems to dislike it, and is frustrated constantly because the judiciary is checking him under the system of checks and balances. So the more I see this, the more I have become a real fan of the U.S. Constitution and the judiciary. One of my bumper stickers would be, "Have you hugged a federal judge today?" So I find myself, those principled conservatives who are operating on the facts of the case, I am finding very interesting. I'm also looking for people who are willing to criticize their own side. So, for example, if you are critical of a congressional candidate knocking down a reporter, which I think you should be equally critical of college students preventing somebody from speaking. And until you do those, until you're willing to be as vigorous on both, you are not really operating, I think, on principle of free speech.
Thank you. Well, great. We have some people lined up. So if you keep your questions short, we'd like to get to as many as possible before the end of the program.
Sure. So you described that Orwell was very concerned with surveillance, what is now represented by CIA, NSA, and FBI. But do you think its current situation with this president, this is the only institution that can save the country? And therefore, this point that this surveillance is bad actually is wrong. It's very good.
It's not really a question, but I'll address your point. No, I don't think the security apparatus is the only thing that can save this country, but I'll tell you what can, the U.S. Constitution. As I said, one of the things that Orwell really did in 1984 was give us the vocabulary to discuss this. When we talk about intrusive government, we frequently use the vocabulary he developed. But we have another vocabulary. It's the vocabulary of the Constitution. And one thing I think the left and liberals should recover is the phrase un-American. When a candidate knocks down a reporter, that's un-American because it violates the Constitution. And we should be willing to say, when the president embraces autocrats and dictators and kings overseas and alienates our democratic allies, that's un-American. When we have a president who seems to actively dislike the Constitution, that's un-American. But the American system was built in anticipation of this. Remember, the Constitution is written in many ways in reaction to the excesses of the British monarchy. What do we do if we have a crazy King George in our own country, is kind of what they're asking themselves. Well, they say, don't give any one sector of the government too much power. Allow the judiciary to stop the executive. Allow the Congress to look into the workings of the other branches. And so we have a system that actually encourages dissent, encourages adversarial discussions. I have no problem with adversarial discussions as long as they are respectful of the law and of the Constitution. Basically, if somebody violates the Bill of Rights, that's un-American. I think that's what's going to save this country as we watch the president get a multi-billion-dollar education in the Constitution.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Next question, please.
Hi there. I was just curious, while these men, I know they were contemporaries, they obviously they were in different roles and they spoke to different people. But did they know about each other? Did they write about each other? Were they aware either while they were obviously both in their careers, and then maybe later was Churchill, when he was reflecting, perhaps, did he think about Orwell?
Good question, and the answer is yes, they never met each other, which is surprising for a country that has a relatively small elite. They knew people who knew each other. Malcolm Muggeridge, a British writer, for example, edited Churchill's memoirs for publication in a newspaper, and also became a close friend of Orwell's in the late 40s. And recall, of course, that the hero of 1984 is named Winston, and there was only one Winston in Britain of the 1940s. The other politicians were known as Attlee or Baldwin or Chamberlain, but Churchill was known as Winston. And the last thing, and also Churchill, we know, read 1984 twice, loved it and recommended it to his doctor. And the last thing that Orwell wrote and published from his deathbed was an admiring review of Churchill's war memoirs, in which he said that this is a man who really, while a politician, writes like a human being, which is about the highest praise he could give him. And he, in that same essay, salutes Churchill's largeness of spirit, which I think is a wonderful phrase because even now it resonates. You read that and you say, oh, that's right. Whatever his flaws, and they were many, Churchill was a deeply flawed man, and he was wrong on a lot of things, yet he had a largeness of spirit to him.
You know, and once another surprise, his Churchill was surprisingly. You would think he's very well read, but he wasn't. It was shallow but not deep. His reading.
Like a lot of autodidacts, what he knew really well, and what he didn't know, he didn't know. And it was always surprising to people. One day, a woman who wanted to marry him, a quite brilliant woman who would have been a great politician in a later time, quoted one of the odes of Keats to him. He'd never heard of Keats, never heard of the ode, but typical Churchill. The next time he saw her, he had read it, memorized it, and for good measure had memorized the other 5 of Keats' famous odes.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, it seems Churchill's and Orwell's political philosophies have a lot in common with Tocqueville, although he was more concerned with our willing surrender of our liberties as opposed to government intrusion. In your research, did you find that Tocqueville was an influence upon either gentleman?
No, he never comes up, as far as I can tell, in their writings, though Orwell was fascinated by 19th century America in a very romantic way. I don't think he read Tocqueville. I know he was very influenced by Dickens' view of America, especially in the novel Martin Chuzzlewit, which is very funny and scathing in its portrayal of America. And it basically keeps on turning on the question that Samuel Johnson asked: why is it that the drivers of slaves yelp most loudly about liberty?
And during World War II, of course, the behavior of U.S. soldiers in London and in Britain was an issue, particularly the treatment of the black soldiers during that time.
Yeah, the British were shocked that the American army wanted to enforce segregation in England. And they were kind of appalled. They said, you're going to import this loathsome institution of racial separation into our country? Yet the Americans said, you have to, otherwise we'll have discipline problems. And military necessity, again and again, was cited. One of my other heroes in life is George Marshall, who was chief of staff of the U.S. Army in World War II. But he's a human being, and he had a huge blind spot on race. A lot more progress could have been made on race during World War II had Marshall been more attuned to it. And as you saw in the Korean War, the U.S. Army integrated very quickly and quite successfully.
Something tells me that might be on your list of future books too.
I actually would love to help make a movie about the Chosin Reservoir battle, which I think is the most interesting battle in American history. Insufficient attention paid to it it's in the middle of the Korean War.
Stay tuned, guys. Stay tuned.
So what exactly was your research process when writing this book? Because as you mentioned, Churchill and Orwell are quite different. So how'd you go about researching them?
Good question. 3 basic ways. First, I had a researcher in Washington, D.C. to retrieve for me documents I couldn't find, go to the Library of Congress to get things that were obscure. The second thing is it's amazing how much is online nowadays. I couldn't have lived in Maine 15 years ago and done this because I wouldn't have had broadband internet. And so, for example, all these works are online. The British have the equivalent of the Congressional Record. It's called Hansard's, but it's much better than the Congressional Record, much more user-friendly, and much more searchable for things like how many times is this word used in a given month, when does this word appear, how many speeches did Churchill give on a certain subject, and so on. And the third thing and the main thing was books. My office is about half the size of this stage, and by the end of the process, there were you couldn't see the floor. There were just stacks of books everywhere. There's a stack of the writings of Churchill, and over there is the stacks of Orwell. And I think I read pretty much every published diary or letters collection by politicians and writers of the 30s and 40s. And I love the diaries and the letters because they capture the moment. They're not written with hindsight. They're what people think at a given time. And what you see especially is the political weakness of Churchill when he takes power. A lot of people expect him just to last 6 months. It's not like the savior has arrived. It's more like, geez, this buffoon took over. Maybe he can pull it out, but maybe we'll have to surrender to Germany. Those really came alive to me, the diaries and letters.
I think we have time for one more question. Please.
Mr. Ricks, I'm curious, I'm a fan of historical fiction, and you talked about the Battle of Britain and how Churchill marshaled the forces to respond. I wonder what would have happened if instead the British debated as to whether it was actually Germany that invaded and attacked Britain, and if they debated that for months and months, what would the fate of Britain have been?
If they had surrendered? Or?
No, if they just couldn't figure out who had attacked them, kind of like what's going on right now, where 17 intelligence agencies say that Russia's attacked us, but we're not doing anything about it.
Yeah, there was a lot of interest in not looking at the facts in the 1930s in England, as there seems to be today with what exactly has happened with Russia and its relationship with a set of people now in power in our government. I think it would have been very bad for England. They would have dithered away. And one of the things you see is German power increasing dramatically in the late 30s because the British are kind of dithering. If Hitler had been told when he took the Rhineland, I think 1936, no, stop, he would have had to pull back. Instead, he gets the Rhineland, he gets Austria, he gets a chunk of Czechoslovakia. All these things dramatically increase German power in several ways. He gets more land, he gets more people, he gets the Austrian gold and the Czech arms factories. If the British had not leapt in, you would have only seen Nazi power, I think, increase as they took over more and more countries and started extracting people and to serve in their militaries and their factories. And basically, they would have won the war because there was no challenge. And they would have turned their attention, I think, by about 44, 45 to how to conquer America. And, they were interested in nuclear weapons. They were building a bomber called the America Bomber that was supposed to be a transcontinental aircraft.
I think that's it. I think that's all we have time for. Tom Ricks, thank you very much. Congratulations on the book.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you for coming out, and books and signings will be available outside the auditorium. So thanks again.
And that was author Thomas Ricks, live from the 33rd Annual Printers Row Lit Fest. Now, the next author presentation will be a conversation about President Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and their relationship with Martin Luther King. That begins in just a few minutes.
My bag. Board author waiting for his turn. Yes. Good. How are you? Good.
How was that?
What he did so well was bring out.
Oh, yeah.
He allowed me to sort of how much I love this something. Okay.
Yeah, it should be short video. That's perfect. Right here, right here. Hey, I love, you're my favorite Fox interview. Shortest and favorite of all time. Well, I try to tell people.
Not theirs.
Oh, not theirs. That was great. That's the one with a Lit Fest pass, please, on here for me. And you want to personalize the thing? I wish you were on every day. It'd be my favorite thing of all. You know how to spell it for you?
Just to read our
You want to personalize the name?
And this one too? Yes.
Hey, where's Joe? Back there looking at some.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for everything you do.
Thank you for coming out.
Thank you. You were the highlight of Lit Fest for us. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you, and I agree with your Hemingway.
Why did you ask that question?
Just because I've done some research work in the past, and it's just interesting to learn.
Okay, tell them what Dad just said.
Oh yeah, my dad just said that I can't cover my whole story book.
Thank you.
Yeah, yes I
Tell
can.
him Congress gave you like
Okay, I will.
Thank you so much. To Harold, my son, who loves Winston Churchill, and I love George Orwell.
Well, you can read the chapters to each other.
Okay, thank you so much.
They alternate. Brilliant book, Tom. Loved it.
You're welcome.
Thank you, sir.
That was fun.
Great talk. I share your disdain for him. And I live in a park, actually.
I think a century from now, no.
I don't like any of this. I feel the same.
Just want to sign Tom's.
Yeah, just sign.
That's a good spot right
Thanks
there.
again.
Actually, I like that better. That was a good idea. Okay.
I'll get it.
Okay.
I know where it is.
Thank you. Would you like
I especially like your comments on first the Beatles and then the principled conservatives. As well as obviously everything you have to say about the two principles.
The Beatles are kind of a running theme, but it's all in the footnotes because my editor said, get the Beatles
Okay,
out.
I'll check out the footnotes.
For
Thank
my
you.
colleague, his dog's name is Winston. He's a big Churchill fan. This is a great presentation. Thank you very much.
Very interesting. Okay. For Jeff and Mary.
Yeah, that'd be great.
When I was a kid, I thought this was pronounced Geoff.
I got a lot of that at college.
I also thought Phoebe was pronounced as Phoebe.
Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Oh,
Yeah, yes, he does.
on the count of three, folks. I'll take two. 1, 2, 3. We got one more. 1, 2, 3. Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a full-service literary festival.
You're welcome. You want a personalized page?
I can't decide who I'm going to give this to.
Okay. I could write for a great American.
They might take that wrong. America great.
Oh, you're right.
I'm a person. Thank you so much.
There we are. There's the name. Looking forward to it. And 2 years.
Folks are taking this.
You mentioned segregation and integration in our services. We just bought a book by a gentleman writing about black pilots for the Nazis, and they were fully integrated. Not an issue.
Oh,
Here at the festival, yeah.
well, they were also the Nazis.
Oh, yeah, perfect. Okay.
And there's no O in it.
A lot of folks are to get to know
Where in Maine is it?
Deer Isle.
Oh, okay. I know exactly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're excited. I heard you had the Pittsburgh Military Library a few years back and had Fiasco and other books from you, so I'm glad to add this to my collection. Zoom on your next.
Thanks very much. Once I figure out what it is.
Sure you will. 100%. Okay. You can just. She didn't get a chance to write her name down. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
You want to personalize it?
Yeah, it's Arthur.
Okay.
A-R-T-H-U-R. You know, your Britishness.
A-R-R?
T-H-U-R.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. Great to meet you. Thank you.
And this book?
This is for Scott.
Two cheese?
I was interested in the question about the methodology. I worked at a university and I was taking history classes.
That girl who asked the question stopped by and she said, but her immediately leaned over and said, you may not have your floor covered with books. Tell her Tom Rickson is okay.
Is she a history major?
Yeah. She looked like she was in high school.
Yeah.
This is John. John?
Yeah, John. Thank you so much. You want me to talk us up? So, if you want to buy the water, anything,
I got one on business.
Oh, wait. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were...
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Jump on there.
Yeah, and if it's okay just to get a signature, because it's probably after I read it carefully, clean hands, it will go to somebody, but I haven't, it's got 2 candidates.
Okay.
But I can always...
I can make it out of both of them.
Well, but then they may end up with a different person.
Okay.
Yeah, so but then I'll just have to buy another copy. But you won't...
Buy
you won't,
the
you won't-
paperback.
Right. Oh, but it just came out in hardcover.
Yeah, it'll be a year.
Probably, okay, yeah, that'll work. Okay, that was a great discussion, and I saw this book, you see it going by, and I hadn't really zoomed in on it, and I'm glad I chose to come today. So,
Can you find those writing styles that's been influenced by either Orwell or Churchill? Have you become a little bit more florid or not?
It's funny you should ask that because my editor said to me after I turned the final version of this book in, book number 6, he said, Tom, I think you finally learned how to write. And he said you've clearly been influenced by immersing yourself in Orwell for several years.
Orwell.
He said your writing has become more straightforward, crisper, and faster.
Marvelous.
But he's a very quotable editor. He also said, because he didn't like the first draft. The first draft is for the writer, the second draft is for the editor, the third draft is for the reader.
Oh my gosh, did you have to do 3? No, you only did 2.
No, well, I did a total overhaul. I mean, the first draft, I threw out and I disassembled it all. Like a house that was not built right.
Yeah.
And I assembled my materials, I redid it. The first book had been thematic. With, the second book, the second version was chronological.
Okay.
The first draft was very much about the books and the works, not about the people as much. And he said, you've got to put the people in front of the books.
Yeah.
It has to be people before words. And he scrawled at one point in the first draft manuscript, if only you would defer to the narrative, you could get away with murder. So I deferred to the narrative in the second draft. And then the third draft, I mean, basically, then he did a normal edit where he just sort of said, why this? I don't like this. Too much on this. Put all the stuff about the Beatles in the footnotes.
Sounds like drafting legislation.
Yeah, but there's all this Beatles stuff in the book that I just had fun with. And he just said, look, because I was sort of playing with the 3 Winstons. Winston Churchill, George Orwell's Winston, and John Winston Lennon.
I didn't remember that. I didn't need it. Or if I ever knew it.
Well, he also changed his middle name to Yoko, or Ono, I think.
Okay.
And he stopped using Winston later
Was
on.
the final book about half the length of the original draft, the first draft?
No, actually, the first draft was shorter.
Oh, really?
Partly because I would gallop through the themes, and he said, relax and tell us the stories and show us. Don't tell us he was XYZ. Give us a story that illustrates it.
Yeah.
The odd thing was I found when I reordered it chronologically, instead of having to have a big wind-up and throat clearing explaining why I was telling you this, it almost became self-explanatory. You know, instead of saying he was under great stress, you just show, like May 10, 1940, this 18-hour day that Churchill has. You know, he becomes prime minister, the war is exploding, British aircraft are being shot down, a British ship is torpedoed, and he ends the day, I think at a 3 a.m. meeting with the British intelligence officer, and he says, go to America and figure out how to get the result of the war. Because he knows that's the only way. He can hold off the Germans, but he can't win without America.
Marvelous story.